Right, welcome everyone. It is just about 10 o'clock, I think. I'll just check my phone and make sure we're not leaving anyone behind. 10 o'clock on the dot. Good old Apple, aren't they reliable? Can I just check that we actually have sound? Is someone able to confirm that we have sound and visual?
Yep,
yes, all good.
Excellent, thank you very much. Look, we're getting progressively close to the end of this course, so it's it's a really lightning fast term, and I'm sure you're feeling it as well. This week we'll get straight into the Zoom Interactive. We're looking at the physical sciences assessment, and this session is pretty much going to build on the content session. There's not too much more we can say about assessment really. All we can do now is start to organise some of our thinking around assessment, in particular how that thinking is going to help us tackle assessment task number 2, because it's quite a deep task, 3,500 words, analysing 2 huge units. And depending which units you pick, they can be up to, 200 pages of content there. That's a massive task. And what we're supposed to do in 3,500 words is break that down into bites of assessment, categorise that assessment, link it to understandings, engagement and motivation, and then identify some spaces within that where we could add 4 recommendations to improve the assessment weight and value of those tasks. So it's quite a detailed task. When we look at assessment content in sciences, you're really swimming around up to your neck in it. And at this stage, I'll just ask, has anybody got anything in particular they would like me to cover this session or talk to this session? Speak now or forever hold your truth. All right, feel free to throw it in as we get going, and let's get going. A one-off change for next week. I'm going to be on the road, and there's some doubt about whether I'm going to be back in time for the 10 o'clock session. And something I've been meaning to experiment with for quite a while is to see how 6 p.m. in the evening suited people. So next week we're going to do 6 p.m. in the evening. It will be recorded, so if you can't make the 6 p.m, don't panic. But rather than not have a session, I'd like to book in the 6 p.m. one just to ensure that we do have a session. So, and it'd be interesting to see whether that opens the door for some other people who are at work to actually attend and give them a chance to ask some questions prior to the end of the year. Julie's saying 6 p.m. is okay, which is good. So we'll give that a try next week. It's more out of necessity than anything else, but it also opens the door to see how other students will respond to that, whether it gives people a chance to get involved. So an overview of the week. Again, we'll just follow our usual scenario here. It's about planning science learning. As a result, I introduced a person called Dr. John Briggs and the Solo taxonomy. Now, you don't need to master the Solo taxonomy. What you need to do is just understand that the Solo taxonomy is a way of looking at assessment task number 2. Because what it does, it picks up the learning objective and it says, ultimately, does assessment match this learning objective? Is the assessment living up to delivering the learning objective or the learning outcome that you started off wanting to deliver? And that's basically what the Solo taxonomy is. I'll talk a little bit more about it. You do not need to be an expert in it. Okay, if you want to look it up and learn a little bit about it, it will reinforce everything you're trying to do with assessment task number 2. But Biggs basically says we start with the learning outcomes, then we design our teaching and learning, and then we design our assessments. So he says assessment comes last. So that no matter what we do in our teaching and learning of understandings, engagement and motivation, the assessment is the last thing we build to make sure that it tacks over the top of both our outcomes, our learning outcomes, and our teaching and learning events. So it's a pretty common sense notion, really. And it's quite amazing that someone got famous coming up with that. But Biggs did get very famous and, of course, now travels the world talking about the Solo taxonomy. Right, Wendy, should be okay. Depends when the kids get hungry. Okay, fantastic. It does present all sorts of issues, but we'll give it a try for next week, the 6 p.m. time slot. So also this week, because assessment task number 2 focuses very heavily on formative assessment, in the learning activities for this week, I've posted up a range of resources that you might want to include and incorporate as recommendations in your units and modules. Now the resources stand alone. They're tried and tested. There's nothing new about them. I've just gone and found a range of resources, predominantly 1- and 2-page activities that you can do, but they are really, really good at helping build formative assessment. And they may, they may deliver some of the gaps in learning that you identify in your existing units of study. So have a look at them, everything from traffic lights right through to little rubes and cubes you can make where the kids sort of write little questions and answers on it and you know, build their own learning resources. And the ultimate goal, of course, this week was to explain ways in which student scientific understanding can be effectively enhanced. Basically, looking at assessment task number 2. So the key terms, we talked about assessment. Now, Batters gives a really good description, Batters gives a really good definition here of what assessment is. And it's just a sample. It's a snapshot taken from a larger domain of content and process skills. Note that. So we've got inquiry skills. We've got the content can be, you know, for instance, scientific endeavour. It can be understandings. So it's a sample taken from a larger domain of content and process skills that enables us to infer a judgment about student understanding of part of a larger domain that we are exploring. And it can include behaviours, products, knowledge and performances. It's continuous and it's ongoing. This week we also talk about exploratory discussions, okay, and here we've got the formative notions, thinking out loud, interthink, talking to a group. We've got assessment strategies. A range of them include observations, role play, models, dance, drawing and art. Okay, so we're trying to bring, and we'll talk about this next week in engagement, we're trying to bring the STEAM or the esteem, you know, that's empowerment, science, technology, engineering, art and mathematics. That's an acronym, esteem, bringing all of those components to student learning so that we're looking at a 360-degree assessment of the individual. And authentic learning, of course, is something we talk about constantly. Real world situations, but the qualifier here, and Batters is very strong at talking about this, if you do read any of his work, there's significant tasks that have relevance to students' life inside and outside the classroom. And of course, you know, Dennis Goodrum talks about that as being the foundation of the Australian curriculum. So, you know, this week is largely revision. We are putting a noose around a lot of our previous 4 weeks and sort of saying, yeah, this is the pointy end. This is where all our understandings come together, where we can create some common ground understandings about what is assessment. And hopefully, you know, I've put 4 of these up in the content lecture this week, where I talk about constructivism. And we've got Vygotsky's wonderful notion of constructivism here, the zone of proximal development. And we know that constructivist teaching is all about how that zone, the individual interacts with a more capable other within that zone. So the second dot point there, constructivist theory, must link 3 related issues: student prior knowledge, student learning styles, and teaching for depth of understanding rather than breadth of coverage. Now that came up beautifully in the forums this week. I think it was Helen asked, can we use the same rubric as a recommendation for more than one recommendation? And absolutely you can. I mean, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to the forums. The 5 principles for effective assessment. In this week's content lecture, I talk about purpose and impact, validity and fairness, reliability, significance and efficiency. It's taken as given that these things exist. So this common ground is where you should start from with assessment task number 2. It's your starting point. Everything we've done up to date talks about these facts. Assessment tackles 8 knowledge domains. It's not just about declarative or content knowledge. It's also about conditional. It's the how we get to know things, the procedural, the application knowledge, problem-solving knowledge, critical thinking knowledge, documentation knowledge, how we write back as learners about our understanding. And of course, understanding, science understandings as a knowledge domain. So there's 8 of them. So our assessment should be tackling all of those. So when you're looking at your units, can you tick each of those domains? Is the assessment actually addressing each of those domains? And it may not have to, as long as it lines up with its objective. And its objective may, for instance, to develop science understandings around a particular physical science, such as forces. And you may have 2 direct learning outcomes on forces, and then the assessment, of course, must interrogate those. And this is the Solow taxonomy. Does the assessment deliver on the learning outcomes? Assessment comes in different forms. This came up in the forum too this week. Can diagnostic and formative both be taught at the diagnostic stage or relied upon at the diagnostic stage? Yes, it can. In old Edubabble or education speak, we used to talk about baseline assessment. And baseline was always a combination of diagnostic and formative, done at the beginning of a lesson, where you tried to basically interrogate students' understandings and establish a baseline to begin your teaching, where you began your teaching from. And that can be a combination of diagnostic and formative. So yes, the answer to that one is definitely formative assessment can occur at the beginning stage of your inquiry process. So just to rehash there, we also talked in the content lecture this week about assessment types. And we've got our baseline assessments, what they're for, right through to our portfolios, which are formative as well as summative. They're progressive, they're longitudinal, they're done over time. They assess a wide range of activities, so you're getting a full 360 evaluation, and they provide really good dialogue for talking to parents and reporting learning behaviours. They can be very specific and very useful. So there's a whole range of repertoires there. Now, the words integrate approaches keeps popping up throughout the readings. Julie is absolutely spot on. A portfolio is totally about integration. It's about integrating a range of one-off assessment items so that when we actually do our reporting process, we have the data. The data pool we build is sufficient to report on all aspects of student learning. So we're talking about integrating, and when we look at our units, how well is the learning outcomes integrated into the assessment tasks and the assessment steps. BIGS, quite simply, says start with the learning outcome, do your assessment last. And the question we use when we look at BIGS is basically, does the assessment address the learning outcomes? And just to remind you, we're talking here about BIGS being a model for us to match assessment to learning outcomes. And learning outcomes, of course, structure our learning tasks and events, and those learning events then guide what we're looking to be assessed. Now, in the forum this week, one of the questions was, the unit I'm looking at, I think this one also came from Susan Roche, the unit I'm looking at has a range of science inquiry skills mentioned at the beginning of it, and yet it only assesses one science inquiry skills. Is that a problem, or is that usual, I think was the question. And the answer is, yes, it is quite normal to do that, because just because it's mentioned and it's addressed in the unit doesn't mean that you're specifically going to assess it. You may prioritise a particular inquiry skill or set of inquiry skills over another set, and you then may pick up that second set of inquiry skills, the ones you haven't prioritised, in your next unit of study, and therefore that's our definition of what a continuous unit is. And BIGS talks about this. What is our learning outcome? The learning outcome would specifically state what your assessment, what your science inquiry skill was, and then your assessment task would address it. So this diagram here, we've got the one on the right-hand side. BIGS talks about this, you've got 5 levels of performance. The very best, highly satisfactory, quite satisfactory, just a pass, and the one missing I didn't put on is incompetent, because it's kind of negative. But the model basically suggests teaching and learning activities must feed into the outcomes. Okay, and assessment tasks must address your marking criteria, your rubrics must explicitly state what those outcomes are. And this is really assessment task number 2. Does anyone have a question about this approach? No? Good, we'll move on. Can I just check and see who's still with us? Okay, we've still got Amy, Julie, Suzanne, Wendy. Good, okay, a couple of people have managed to survive the blackout or the brownout. My apologies. Going back to week 7, I actually put up this task here and said, here's a really good idea for looking at assessment task number 2 too, because obviously we're looking at the 5 E's on the left-hand side of the page, and the steps involved in the 5 E's, that is the teaching and learning steps. On this side, we've got the questions that the solo taxonomy that BIGS would actually ask. And of course, this also is embedded in the Science by Doing. Okay, this resource where I got this from. It is the Student Learning Professional module, and it basically says the 5 E's model explicitly connects, okay, to student learning. And again, it's a very useful model. And the questions we ask ourselves at the engage stage, is the interest and curiosity of students captured? Okay, so obviously we'll be doing some assessment around that. Is the context relevant to students? Again, we'll be doing some assessment around that. Has information about the student's present understanding been obtained? And of course, we know that's our baseline, our diagnostic and our formative assessment at the engage stage. So these are the questions that we can ask ourselves at each stage of the 5 E's that helps us understand whether assessment is addressing the learning objectives. So again, Biggs's work is significant and the foundation for much of the structure of the Australian curriculum of science. Bloom also appeared this week. When we look at Bloom's taxonomy, we've got our 6 levels here. Knowledge, the base level, leads to comprehension, application, analysis, evaluation, synthesis, and creation. And we know that Bloom's is essentially a cognitive model, but cognition is actually mediated by language. And language, of course, in this context is verbs, is transitive verbs, here we are instructing the mind, instructing the thinking process, instructing cognition to perform a function or task. And we can see this is taken up by Biggs and Collis also. Here are the types of verbs we see that we should see, for instance, in our assessment. So if we're designing a rubric, these are the kinds of higher level functions that we'd be looking for: analysis, evaluation, and synthesis or creation. At the middle of the rubric, we're looking here at some analysis, some application, some comprehension. And the lower levels of a rubric or an assessment task or levels of performance, we're looking at comprehension and knowledge. And this is also reflected by Biggs. So when we're looking at these models, we're looking at Bloom's, we're looking at Biggs, these are actually windows into judging the adequacy and the function and the relevance of our assessment strategies. Are they addressing the tasks that they need to be addressing at the levels, at the deeper levels they need to be addressing them? Because let's face it, some of these units are 8 lessons long, and that's a long time to spend in a student's year as a learning event. So they're quite deep lessons. They go deep. And, that's one of the notions of the Australian curriculum in science: go deep, okay, rather than go wide or go far, go deep. And, hence the notion of consecutive units. All right, so let's talk about links to assessment task number 2. Anybody got any questions they'd like to ask at this particular stage, apart from why does the system drop out halfway through? All right, let's get going. You're very quiet today. Links to assessment task number 2. In the materials this week, we talk about constructive alignment. That is constructive alignment between learning objectives or learning outcomes and assessment and teaching. So it's got to be right across the school. I mean, ultimately, this is the goal for most schools. Good schools do it well. There is an alignment right across the school. Through the professional goals of the teachers, the wants and needs of students, the curriculum, the teaching methods, right through to the psychological and social climate of the school. So cognitive alignment and constructive alignment are themes that can be done within a subject, within a unit of study, but even right across the system. And this is, where Biggs becomes particularly powerful. And Biggs' model argues that when we get imbalance in the system, it leads to poor teaching and surface learning. Non-alignment is signified by inconsistencies, unmet expectation, and practices that contradict what we preach. So this brings us to, what are these? What are the sorts of things that we may find in our units of study? And the obvious thing is the learning objective, the standard of performance. Point number 1, are we using appropriate action or transitive verbs? Things like appreciate. Someone tell me how you measure appreciation. Is it by the size of someone's smile? Become awareness. Is it how high their eyebrows go up on their head? Familiarise with. How do you measure that? Know, learn about. These are quite poor descriptors. And of course, if you're looking at a unit of study and these are some of the outcomes, then clearly, assessment of those kinds of outcomes is going to be really tricky and vague. Are all 4 steps of the alignment process evident? So in other words, when you're looking at your unit, are the intended outcomes written down as standards and described as standards using appropriate verbs? And that kind of connects to point number 1. Are you creating a learning environment likely to deliver those outcomes, your teaching and learning? Do your assessment enable you to judge your assessment statements and the learning outcomes, enable you to judge if and how well students' performances meet the outcomes? And have you developed grading criteria for judging the quality of students' performance? Now, there are 4 steps in what Biggs would call, constructive alignment. Is there some one of those perhaps that, you can look at your unit and say, okay, the intended outcomes aren't well described. The learning environment is not actually going to deliver those outcomes. Student performances, there's no clear statement on what constitutes competent performance here. Grading criteria, okay, how do I allocate a grade? Okay, how do I measure levels of performance because it's not explicitly stated? And here may be the recommendation you make. Some other questions we talked about, assessment approaches, emphasising understanding, okay, rather than memorising. Is it creating access for understanding rather than surface knowledge and recall of facts? And so on. Now, I talked about these questions and points in the content lecture this week. And these are, 7 areas that you could put, 7 questions, little torches you can put to your unit of study to actually see whether it has any of these gaps. And if you can identify some of these gaps and you think they're apparent and relevant, what sort of recommendations might you make around that? Do assessment approaches employ and also assess collaborative learning skills? And that's a really important point, because you are putting students in groups and teams, and how well is that working for you? How's it going? How do you even know that what you're doing is relevant? So the collaborative learning skills, and let's face it, there's some of the generic competences that we look across the curriculum. Science by doing, and also the primary connections modules are all done in group work and collaborative settings. So those 7 questions, they're put there to guide you to have a look at your own units. Is the assessment living up to expectations? Seghers does the same thing, except he does it using, from his meta-analysis here, looking at what's happened in education, particularly science education, over the last 40 years. What have been the changes? And he says, well, we can look at it. We can look at, it's changed. Science teaching and assessment has changed in terms of the authenticity. It used to be decontextualized and atomized. Here's a multiple test on this. Here's a little pen and paper test on this. Now, as the question that came out, or the point that came out on the chat before, it's integrated, it's contextualized. We've got, rather than a single measure, we've got multiple measures. Instead of levels of comprehension, where we're trying to measure the lowest levels, we're now trying to measure the highest levels of comprehension in learners by using multiple tasks over a range of domains. Dimensions of intelligence were few. Now our curriculum actually has 3 dimensions instead of science knowledges, where it used to be. It now has inquiry skills, human endeavours, and science understanding. So we've got multiple knowledge domains, and they include skill domains, and they also include behavioural domains. So we've gone from a very narrow to a very broad perspective. Relation to the learning process, isolated to integrated, responsibility from the teacher, and it's been shifted to the student. Maybe Seghers is a good way for you to look at your units. Can you apply Seghers to your units of study to identify any potential gaps? And again, what I'm throwing up here are ways for you to consider this, ways for you to think about your units of study. What might be some gaps in, what are some very, very good units of study, but they're not perfect. And the point we make in the forum this week is, when you try to grab a unit as a plug and play unit, as a teacher, you're going to have to think on your feet. You're going to have to make adjustments. And Biggs is saying the most important adjustment you make is in assessment. So when looking, here are our 10 questions. Is its primary focus purpose to improve student performance? Is it based on understanding? Is it an integral component of course design, not something added on afterwards? This is our assessment. Does it provide useful information to report and to report on achievement? Does it have clarity of purpose, goals, standards, criteria? Does it employ a variety of measures? Are its methods valid, reliable and consistent? Does it pay attention to outcomes and inquiry processes? Is it ongoing rather than episodic? And will the learner feedback and reflection lead to improved performance? These 10 questions are a summary of the previous 5-6 slides. Here are the questions you can actually put to your unit of study. And this will open up some areas for you to check out in terms of the assessment tasks embedded there. Any questions about that? Or comments? We are extremely quiet today. Amy, does any of that seem strange to you, or is there something you're wondering about?
No, it's all good. I was just I was going to just say about point number 5 on the previous slide. I really liked, or not the previous slide, about 2 or 3 slides back. That one. Does the assessment regime establish students' prior knowledge and monitor students' changing conceptions? Because I think with the formative assessment, being able to monitor the students' conceptions and see the changes in it, I think would be really interesting.
Spot on, and that's where you're looking for your assessment items. You know, that's where you're going to make a lot of recommendations, isn't it, in terms of how to do that. And some of the tools that I threw up on the Moodle for this week, threw up's probably a poor choice of term, but some of the tools that I posted there are really, really excellent formative assessment strategies. And your recommendation may simply be employing this tool or that tool to ascertain student understandings at this critical point, at this critical juncture of the unit and the knowledge construction. SEGAs is useful too. Okay, really good for looking at your unit and saying, okay, yep, it ticks all of those boxes, or it doesn't tick those boxes well. Okay, and of course our 10 direct questions. All right, so this week we had a couple of activities too. The third thing I normally do in these Zoom sessions is look at some of the activities. And again, you know, the visual representation. So we had this in the Moodle for the week, and each week, you know, I don't know how much depth you're going into with your Moodle tasks at the moment, or whether you're prioritizing your assessment, and the choice is entirely yours. But there are some Moodle tasks posted in there, and so, you know, some really good ideas. The watermelon analogy, when we're looking at visual representations of complex science concepts, and this all goes back to our modelling, our cognitive modelling, or our mental modelling approaches. And of course, we then work with the students' mental models, and we then help to reconstruct them. So some links there that we've put on that might be good models for you to use in the future. The mouse cheese analogy is another one. I won't take you there to look at them now, because I think we're probably better spending our time talking about the assessment and the relevant things there. Activity number 2 asks you to design a summative assessment task. And yeah, it's a fun activity that if you've got the time to do, it's well worth doing. This is one that I did with a group of students at a local school in Cairns. And you know, the question I've got here is guess the year level. Have a look at the complexity of this task. They decided they want to host a rave party. And, you know, I was working with a pre-service teacher at the time, and they said, you know, we want to use robotics. You know, can you come in and help us set up a task? So I said, fantastic. This is when I was working at JCU. And so they wanted to do a host party, a rave party. They wanted lots of cordials, and they want lots of lollies, and they want to have lots of fun and dancing. And they also want the coolest music. And so, but they had a debate about what was cool music, and they couldn't resolve it. So in the end, they decided that what they were going to do was design an automated music system that can detect when no one is dancing, because if no one's dancing, the music isn't cool. And so what we did is we worked with robots, and we came up with a DJ, a robotic DJ, which was connected to a system which had a scanner, which was also connected to 3 visual scanners over the dance floor. And when the scanners failed to detect any movement, the music automatically shifted to the next song. And the kids came up with this resolution themselves. And it was done at the end of a unit on robotics. It was done at the end of the unit on the similarities between robots and humans. And of course they decided, well, you know, one best summative way to do that would be to have a look at what a DJ might do at a disco and a dance floor compared to what a robot might do, and how their responses could be similar. So fascinating outcome for a group of Year 5 students. I thought it was quite a powerful task. And you know, we actually, the final stage of the summative assessment was to have a dance. And of course, when everybody froze on the dance floor, the song changed. So their technical solution actually worked. So summative assessment. You can have a lot of fun designing these things. Books on light and shadow and colours, a couple of links there. The Butterfly Book of Colours, Lemons Are Not Red. Have a look at these. They're posted for you mostly as resources, so that you can have a look at them for yourselves, for your own units of study going forward and your own teaching. Where is the Green Sheep? A book by Mem Fox. Great little book. And of course, you know, the task is ultimately culminates in something very ICT based in digital video, which is a really good task too, as a summative assessment task. Activity 4, the Deadly 60, about using digital cameras. Again, you can use it. It's an online interaction where you can manipulate an online camera, and it helps solve the deeply scientific question of focus, and what makes a good picture, what makes a bad picture, what happens when you move a camera back and forward, what impact it does have on the quality of the picture. And of course, we then move on to force as examples and friction. A little activity there that comes from Gregson. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, do have a look at it. You know, it's all useful stuff for you to take forward. I'm not going to impose them on you because I know you're busy, but if you do get a chance, it's always good to keep your own knowledge and experiential framework kicking along in the background. And okay, another shot of the Gregson example. And activity 6, creativity in science. What I've got here is a little image of First Lego League, which is a robotic challenge. I'll talk a little bit about this next week when we do our session on engagement. And you can see here that what kids do is they build robots, they play on a game-sized table, and the robot has to perform 13 challenges in 2.5 minutes. And for each challenge they get points. And the challenge is always based on real-world issues, so it's all very authentic learning, and the children become very creative around it. They also have to do a research project as well and design and engineer their own robots. So it's incredibly creative. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, but have a look at creativity in science. And here I'm talking about STEAM, you know, where we add the arts to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We add the arts, it becomes STEAM. And then we add empowerment, and it becomes STEAM. And these are, you know, quite powerful acronyms now. And the First Lego League is an excellent example of STEAM. Because kids participate in this and then they go back to their communities. In California, for instance, that they actually designed a tool using PVC piping that rolled in with the tide and rolled out with the tide and distributed sand as it rolled in and rolled out to prevent tidal sand wash. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor at the time, was so impressed by this that he actually commissioned a commercial version of it to stop beach erosion at Santa Barbara Beach. So kids are brilliant. Kids I worked with up in Cairns produced a nanobait technology, and they patented the design where they had little fish that were micro robots, and the robot was programmed to swim in the way that a particular bait fish swam. And the aim was, of course, to preserve the species of bait fish which were endangered. So they designed a nanobot, essentially, patented it. Their parents helped them patent it, and they're sitting there now, and I think they're going to production in a year or two. So because they're now turning 17 and 18. So kids can be brilliant, you know, and science and creativity go together there. Anyone done anything or like to share anything creative that they've done in a science classroom that may have involved even drawing or mapping or sketching or building models, clay, all of these different techniques?
Colin, would it work with, because like I really like the idea of bringing in the STEM and the STEAM stuff. Like if I'm doing electricity, and because it's got the sustainability underpinning the actual unit, kids to bring their own favourite battery-powered toy along and actually convert it to a solar toy, instead of actually just doing the assessment piece. Like, I think that would be more valuable to them, converting a toy into something.
Brilliant, Julie. And if, you know, it's not difficult to set up that process either. But if you don't want to set it up, there are also little solar-powered Matchbox cars as well. That I think they cost about $4 to buy. They're not terribly expensive, and a class set of those can achieve some wonderful learning. So it's you know, it's a great strategy. I like that one. All right, from the forums. We had quite a bit of activity in the forums this week, which is fabulous. People are starting to really use them to engage with the assessment task number 2, and some quite good questions coming up. Susan's been interactive in there, and she talked about the ZBT, the evaluation of a unit. And I'll just try and find her forum post. I think it was in the essence of a unit of study, which, you know, it's got a growing number of posts in it at the moment. And Susan actually put up her own example, which I thought was really courageous of her to do. So she's put up this unit of study where she's actually done her evaluation, and fantastic work. Gives, you know, a really good visual model for what to do. I've actually given some comments on there. I very much like the table, but point out that it could actually be organised and the word limit cut down even more, simply by using headings and subheadings and dot points. That's quite legitimate. Now, I just want to point out that in this assessment task, you don't need to repeat, you don't need to produce the whole unit. The temptation is to think, yes, let's do the whole unit. The aim is not to do the whole unit. It's actually to pluck the key aspects of that unit out. If you still need to do more, put it in your appendix, you know, purely if you think you haven't finished the task. But basically, dot points, subheadings and dot points in your table will be more than adequate. Okay, so it's really important to you know, to have a look at that. And Susan shared that with us, and I do appreciate. Have a look at the comments, because you may find them useful as well. To rubric or not to rubric. Tess had a really, you know, Tess has made some great posts to the forum, and was having a look at the notion of designing a rubric, and actually asked the question, should she actually design a rubric or just talk about it, and point to the rubric being as a good solution as part of a recommendation. And I pretty much said to her, I think in that feedback, that rubrics, you know, are not unicorns. We can't suggest that they do exist and they're mythical. If you're going to make a recommendation for a rubric, try it, have a go at it. Produce the rubric. It doesn't have to be an outstanding rubric. All it has to do is illustrate the recommendation that you're making. So when we do look at rubrics, rubrics are fabulous in terms of, when you look at your unit of study, Helen points out that her unit of study didn't actually strip down or break down the learning statements or standards or achievement levels. So she was going to design a rubric that did that, and then said, well, other things can come from that rubric too, other recommendations. Absolutely. One rubric can serve for a range of recommendations. You can develop a rubric which may, for instance, allow you to look at making the learning explicit for learners so that they know what they've got to learn, to what degree, in order to achieve at what levels. That's explicating assessment. That's really important. The second thing about a rubric is it can help a student self-reflect. It can help them break down a task and they can see what the learning involved is, what the learning steps, particularly related to science inquiry skills. The third thing about a rubric, it actually connects beautifully to peer learning as well. So it can actually be used to bring together to dialogue at the formative and summative stage, where you actually create a dialogue, and rubrics can actually be used to report to parents as well. It can be embedded in a student portfolio so that you can actually pull out the rubric and you can see where the student has ranked themselves, where their peers have ranked them, and you can discuss that with the parents in terms of learning behaviours. So a rubric can be all four recommendations. I hate to say it, it can be. But again, you've got to justify it. You've got to, you've got to state that that's why, and think, this is why, this is where assessment lacks. This is my identification of a gap. This is the value I could add to it using a rubric. I could then use that rubric to develop inquiry skills. I could then use that rubric to develop peer assessment. I could then use that rubric in terms of my reporting as part of my portfolio instrument. So, rubrics are powerful things. So there's some really, really good answers and questions on the forums this week. If you're not getting on there, do. As you can see, people are getting busy in there, and the types of questions coming up are really, really powerful. And here's my response to Helen's question. One rubric can address a range of recommendations. They are amazing things, and go through and point out to her that there are at least 2x2 recommendations here that she could use. So have a good look at the forums. You'll find there's gold in there. Susan's come up. She's going to attack something or someone. She has a plan. It's fantastic, Susan. She's very much in the forum, very much alive, and go and have a look at what her plan is, and it may give you some ideas as well. And I'm still getting some queries on the notion of a consecutive unit. What is a consecutive unit? And can I just explain that one more time? The old principle I did put in the forums, tell it to me like I'm a 6-year-old. Consecutive unit is one unit simply that follows another. But in your introduction to your paper, again, we've talked here very much about the structure and format, and getting a lot of emails too about, is this structure heading in the right direction? Basically, it's got to have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. The introduction must do one thing. You must tell me what you're going to tell me, and then you must point to your recommendations, even in your introduction, so we know where you're going. Then part B makes a lot more sense. You've got your table. Perhaps it's a table. Perhaps you're not using a table. You're just doing text. That's fine too. But part B, you'll be looking at your unit. You'll define your unit, and the easiest way is to put the title, the year level, the ACS focus. And once you've done that, you then break it down into the assessment focus, okay, the assessment task, the assessment focus, how it tackles understandings, how it tackles motivation, how it tackles engagement or addresses those. Okay. Then you move on to the assessment part. And I have said quite strongly, try and keep your discussion of the units down to about 750 words each. Any more than that, think about what you can put as a subheading and a dot point, and then shift the rest into your appendices, because the units already exist. And in the forum, I describe them as low-hanging fruit. You know, if you break down the unit into its assessment steps, yeah, that's a skill, and that's necessary to do before you can do the second part of the paper. But it's the second part of the paper where the high-hanging fruit is, where most of the high-level discriminating marks sit. So if you do a really good analysis of 2 units, and that's all you do with some average to middling to general, I should say, general is a better word, to general recommendations, if that's what you're doing, then chances are that you're going to be in that middle range of outcomes of levels of achievement. If, however, you do an analysis of your 2 units that demonstrates you understand them, that demonstrates you make the connections, that demonstrates you see links to understanding, to engagement and to motivation, and then you're able to do that in a number of words that allow you 1,500 words to address your 4 recommendations. In your second part, where you get to your recommendations, the second part of the body of your paper, you can then start to throw the furniture around. Leave yourself 1,500 words. That's about 350 words per recommendation. It's still not much. It's still not much to go into detailed analysis. But in there, that's where you throw your literature. That's where you throw your rationale and your judgment. And that's where you talk about how assessment can be strengthened and reinforced and address the areas that it should address. So I'm still getting some queries on consecutive units. And the final part of your paper I forgot to mention is your conclusion. Tell us what you told us. This paper has outlined 2 primary connections units. These units utilise the 5Es model. The 5Es model engages 5 stages of learning. Embedded in each of these 5 stages are various assessment techniques and strategies. These techniques and strategies need to support the learning outcomes of the unit in order to be effective and efficient. And here are 4 ways I've recommended that this could be made more effective and more efficient. End of conclusion. So your consecutive units. Units are consecutive when they follow each other. All you have to do is say why they follow each other. They build on consecutive inquiry skills. They build on consecutive understandings. They're part of a human endeavours framework. They involve ethical problems related to the environment. There is a reason why you've chosen your 2 units. It's not random. We need to see your thinking in your answer. Okay, here are the 2 units I've chosen. Here's where the level of the curriculum they're at. Here's the strands which they address and they're embedded. And here is why I consider them to be consecutive units. Here's me as a teacher speaking. And if you can make those statements, that's probably, it's probably all we could ask. Any questions or comments about that, about things I've just raised there, or about things that are coming up in the forum in general? Now, the reason why I did want to put Susan's up there is she actually talks about the word count, and here it is. I wanted to run past you how I plan to divvy up my word count to ensure I'm putting the correct amount of detail in the right space. And I was thinking of using 750 words in each table. Fantastic. In the body of the assignment, which probably will have 2 parts, one part will be the table, and the second part for Susan will probably be her discussion of the recommendations. To discuss and evaluate formally, perfect. I was then allocating 500 words for each of the recommendations, give or take. Okay, remember, the limit is 3,500 words, plus or minus 10%. So you can go as high as 3,850, and you can go as low as 3,150. Okay, anything below that, chances are, you're failing to go into sufficient detail. Okay, you won't be penalised or failed, but you may be limiting your capacity to move. And my response to Susan is there. So if the verbal version here is too much to digest, and I do talk quickly, go to the forum and have a look at the written response. Susan has a plan of attack. I was relieved to find out it wasn't me who was going to be attacked, but the essay that's going to be attacked, and she has a very good strategy. Start thinking about your strategy. This is the reason we have the forums there. Any other questions or comments? Feel like I'm talking to myself here? Suzanne, do you have anything you need to add or want to add? Wendy, for that matter, Amy, any comments? If it's all okay, that's okay. If it's
Yeah, all good. Just trying to digest it all.
Fabulous. Now, I am sticking to a fairly consistent explanation of things over the last 3 weeks, because we're setting this task up. It is really a very good task, very open task. You take control. You choose your units. You identify what you think is consecutive. You even identify which assessment instruments you're going to pick on and make recommendations about. You are totally in charge. And providing you bring the reader along with you and you justify everything you do, you can't be wrong. It's a great assignment. Fancy that. If someone said to you, Amy, you can't be wrong. Fantastic. But you can be right. And to be right, you need to go through those stages of justifying, bringing the reader along with you, and supporting your discussions and your recommendations with literature-based evidence, that this is in fact what assessment is supposed to do. The final word for the week is Vygotsky. And we know that his fabulous work, back in the 1920s, it wasn't published until 1962, and 1978, his seminal piece, but was, Mind and Society. So he talks about constructivism. Our engagement with life is all based on how our mind processes things and how our mind engages with the world. And he talked, basically about walking around in the zone of proximal development in relation to everything he did and knew. And it's quite a powerful metaphor. And it draws attention, to what the learner can achieve without help and what they can achieve with help. And it also impacts, identifies the power of the environment on learning. Learning can shape an environment, and this is what the teacher tries to do. And the environment can shape learning. And this is where the constructed world of the student needs to be engaged and needs to be interrupted. And Wood, in 1976, came up with the concept of scaffolding. When we locate a ZPD, we then start to lay down schema in that ZPD. And this is why we have a unit, for instance, unit number 1, which may be on heat, and unit 2 may be on friction, because heat is a more simple understanding. And in order to get friction, you actually have to understand heat. So what we've got here is a continuity. These are continuous units. Wood is scaffolding the second unit on top of the first. And then Vygotsky would jump in, roll up his sleeves and start swimming around, poking around the ZPD, or what John Biggs would call the backwash. Because students really only want to learn what they think they need to learn for assessment. But everything around that creates a backwash. And here's where, all the other things that you're trying to teach as a teacher. Biggs says, get out there, make that explicit. Embed that in your learning outcomes, embed it in your assessment. So that way, they're going to cover it anyway. They've got no choice. Get them to surf the backwash, get them to bring all of that out into the open. Here, a couple of reports from Black and Willem in 1998, and also the OECD. The biggest gains in student learning outcomes can be made at the formative assessment stage. Okay, the most powerful gains. And they're amongst the largest ever reported for educational interventions. That's still true today. Black and Willem's study was repeated in 2005, and the difference had even widened. The achievement gains were even higher. So we're on to something here with constructivism. We're on to here with something with socio-cognitive constructivism. Vygotsky was right. Okay, he's onto something here. And there is a need to align formative and summative work in new overall systems. And Black and Willem point out that often teachers felt that summative assessment disrupted learning. Vygotsky says summative assessment, Biggs says summative assessment and formative assessment should be aligned. And in there lies some strategies for you to think about your units of study. All right, at this stage I'm going to stop talking and offer you a chance to ask any open questions or anything you wish to ask. I'll pop the forum up on the screen. It may prompt something you've been thinking about. Is there anything there that anybody's been swimming around in, thinking about, worried about? All right, as you can see, the forum is getting, people are starting to engage and get busy. There's gold in their hills. Go in if you've got a question and have a look at what people are asking and what people are thinking. you know, you may find quite supported in your own thinking. You may find that your thinking is clarified and your peers are doing some fabulous work there. All right, on that note then, if there's no other questions or specific comments, I will actually close the Zoom session down at this point rather than have it shut down on us, and blend them together and post them for general dissemination. But I'd like to remind you again, please, next week's session will be at 6 p.m. in the evening on Wednesday. All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay, no. All right then. Look, thank you for staying in. Thank you for coming back, those who came back. And I will blend this together and get it posted for you. Thanks so much.